I would like to talk about rationality as a methodological stance. And the idea here is that when economists teach their model building, one of the core assumptions is rationality. And that assumption is obviously people aren't rational. If you go around asking economists, it depends how they personally define rationality. And I will get into some definition stuff in a minute about rationality. But most economists know people are irrational. But we still oftentimes use that as a foundation, at the very least to teach our models, but also to sort of structure thought about the world. So how do we think about that? How can we add some complexity here? And you can think of this as a spectrum, where on one end of the spectrum, you have people who believe that false assumptions in a model invalidate the theory. And on the other hand, other side of the spectrum, we have people who believe that all that matters with models is their predictive power. And as long as the model is predicting human behavior that we're observing in the world, it is a good model, even if the assumptions are false. And I mean, my own view is that we actually need both of these people at the table. Like, ideally, we're going to have people all along the spectrum as part of the conversation. And I think the reason we need different people occupying different spaces on this map is because if you spend a lot of time over here, you can create and generate a lot of great models, but your mind sort of focuses in a certain way and develops certain patterns that have certain biases. And of course, we really want people investigating what are the assumptions of the model, how can we make those assumptions better. So the people over here might spend a lot of time trying to falsify assumptions, which is a great thing for science. Science progresses when you have people investing time and effort trying to falsify. And of course, there's going to be tension between these two groups, because this group is going to say, you falsifying my model doesn't make it any less valid than you not falsifying my model, and they're going to be mad at each other. But you want people spending a lot of time on the far ends of this spectrum. Now, if you're sort of in the middle and you're talking with a lot of these people, you want to be a little bit flexible on this point. But I think this strikes people as weird that you might use rationality as an assumption in your model when you know it's false. So how does that even work? And I think the best way to start thinking about this is with game theory. Because, of course, game theory is used to predict how birds behave, how lizards behave. Like, biologists will use game theory to figure out what's going to happen with an evolving population of species that are obviously not rational. And obviously those biologists are not going to be assuming rationality, but they still use the game theory models that set up the structure of incentives for those creatures. And the same is really true with people, because people, of course, have intuitions, they have positive feelings, positive reactions, and negative reactions. They have these emotions that drive them in the same way that animals are driven. And if you build a model that assumes rationality, it can actually do a really good job sometimes of predicting where humans will end up after they experience a situation over and over and develop intuitions about how to act in that situation, in the same way the lizards do. So let me give you a couple of examples from the classroom, these experiments we can do. So one experiment that economists like to do is everybody has a pile of money, or maybe it's a pile of candy or whatnot. And if you add a few pieces of your candy to the middle, then in this commons, and if everybody else does that and whatnot, then the professor will double however much is in the middle, and you'll split that among the group. So, of course, what happens is oftentimes the first time you run the experiment, lots of people will put, half their candy in, some people will put all of their candy in, and some people will put no candy in. And of course, everybody looks at the people who didn't contribute candy and they're like, that's not fair, I'm upset. And when you run the experiment over and over, people will stop putting as much in because they feel a certain way about the people not contributing. So at the end of the day, you can end up with a situation where nobody is contributing after a few rounds. And that's not necessarily because the people participating are rational, though it could be, possibly everyone there is acting rationally, but it can also be just because people have certain feelings and reactions to the situation, and those feelings will inform the way they behave the next time. So if you use game theory to predict what direction will people tend toward, you can assume rationality and get a good prediction even in an entirely irrational situation where people are just sort of reacting and responding. So that's one way of thinking about this. Now, what about the definition of rationality? Because I think a lot of times different communities within academia will use that term differently. So let me give you the definition that I give my behavioral economics students, even though this is actually not the way a lot of economists think about rationality. Okay, one definition is rationality is pursuing enlightened self-interest. And of course, in behavioral economics, we relax all of these assumptions. Like instead of pursuing it, people could be just reacting instinctually. Instead of it being enlightened, well, maybe people don't have good information or whatnot. And self-interest, maybe people care about other people in their lives, as people obviously do. So of course, you could build models that are wedded to this definition of rationality. But if you say, actually, if someone cares about their kids or their spouse or the people around them, maybe that is actually rational. Maybe you can build a model where the utility function is what's in their best self-interest, which includes things that in the world that they care about. So a lot of economists will not really go with this definition, and I think that's tricky. Like, I'm not going to say that this is the right definition. I think it's fine for different communities to have different terms. It just does lead to some misunderstanding, and I'm trying to parse out that misunderstanding in this video. So now let me tell you what I think can sometimes go wrong with these communities. There's always going to be a tension between these people and these people. And my hope is that we create an academic environment where the people, even though they're sometimes going to get mad at each other, where they can collaborate. Because that back and forth tension, I think, is really, really healthy in academia. So let me tell you what problems sometimes arise when these people are upset at those people. So this is a prisoner's dilemma, and I'm not going to explain this right here, but you can sort of test the results of a prisoner's dilemma by doing little experiments where you give students candy in class, or where you give perhaps people on the street money, stuff like that. You can set up these prisoner's dilemmas. And one problem I think that can happen when these people get too entrenched or not open-minded enough is that they can look at the results of the experiment and say, that experiment is not going the way game theory predicts, and therefore the game theory must be wrong. Whereas I think the right way to approach that in this situation is if you're getting a situation where the people are not ending up at the Nash equilibrium, and of course the Nash equilibrium here is to defect, to not cooperate. If you observe them cooperating, what economists will often do is they'll say, actually, that's revealed preference, and what that means is it means we got the payoffs wrong. Like, we thought these were the payoffs, but it turns out in this situation, people care about things other than money. They care about the social outcome. They care about the other person respecting them. There's so many human things they care about. So economists will often say, okay, we need to go back to the drawing board and figure out what is actually in these utility functions. And we need to do that until we have a predictive model. And they'll add things to the utility functions and adjust these payoffs until they actually get the model to match behavior. Now, doing that sort of assumes rationality, according to many economists. And if you were to stop once the model was proven wrong by not playing out, then economists will often say, you've stopped too early. You're letting the science end before you actually have as much information as you could have. Like, you could learn something about what people value by keeping with the assumption of rationality and trying to update our beliefs about what people care about. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think everything can be modeled using game theory, because there are forces like mood and, forces that are very difficult to model. But economists who are over here oftentimes view it as our job to sort of figure out what model of people's utility is going to best predict their behavior. And that's the job. It's not to have accurate assumptions. I'm going to do another video on maximization as a methodological stance, so I will put links to that video once I have it out.